carrier group.
A Venezuelan Navy submarine on a mission near the Bermuda Triangle suddenly vanished from all communication systems. No distress signal, no final coordinates. In just minutes, a modern submarine and over 70 crew members sank to the bottom of the ocean as if they had never existed. The vessel was sunk by a covert U.S. base beneath the Bermuda waters. Automated defense systems utilizing electronic wave technology and smart torpedoes locked onto the target the moment the Venezuelan sub intruded. A massive electrical surge crippled the entire control system. Then, a precise projectile tore through the portside water, flooded the compartments, and the vessel broke in half and sank in absolute silence. In Caracas, the missing report was a dagger to national honor. Generals held an emergency meeting angrily concluding that Bermuda was no longer a natural mystery, but a trap set by the U.S. A bold decision was made that very night, forming a suicide squad. Within days, an elite group was assembled. They were special forces, soldiers, divers, and even volunteers ready to sacrifice themselves. Their goal was to destroy that U.S. underwater base beneath Bermuda. No one expected to return. This was a one-way trip. That night, the ship carrying the suicide squad plunged into the Bermuda waters. They skimmed the surface, overcame the fierce waves, and then dove hundreds of meters deep to approach the base's gate. Faint yellow lights flickering from the seabed confirmed that the American steel monster truly existed. But before they could even set the explosives, hell opened up. Automated defense systems detected a barrage of mini torpedoes launching alongside an electromagnetic net sweeping the seabed. In less than 10 minutes, the entire suicide squad was wiped out. Bodies and fragments of equipment floated in the cold currents, unable to emit a single signal. Bad news returned to Caracas. Accelerating silence blanketed the cabinet meeting room. The Venezuelan government knew their military was not strong enough to confront the Bermuda death base, but the humiliation only fueled their rage. The president slammed his hand down, ordering, "If we are not strong enough, we will buy strength." A new plan was launched employing international mercenaries. Warriors who had fought across the Middle East and Africa, equipped with modern skills and advanced weaponry. They fought not for ideals, but for money. And this time, the contract was named Bermuda Revenge. The final report from Bermuda was presented to the Venezuelan president in a locked conference room. The pale yellow light illuminated his cold face. The large screen displayed only a few lines of data before losing contact. Sudden speed drop, hull pressure exceeding limits, then the signal faded into nothingness. The entire squad Caracas had pinned its hopes on was blown away in minutes by the U.S. base's automated defense system. The air in the room was thick with indignation. An old general slammed his fist on the table. This is a national disgrace. But the brutal truth was undeniable. The Venezuelan military was too weak to breach the American high-tech defenses. Analysts pointed out that the underwater base didn't just have sonar and automated torpedoes, but also underwater laser turrets, multi-layered thermal sensors, and a pervasive electromagnetic field. It was a modern fortress that even leading naval powers would be wary of. The president remained silent for a long time, then quietly growled, "If we are not strong enough to take revenge ourselves, we will use money to hire the best." The decision was approved that very night. Caracas urgently opened a special fund. Billions of US dollars from oil reserves were secretly funneled out to find a mercenary solution. In the age of asymmetrical warfare, mercenaries were no longer an uncommon concept. From the Middle East to Africa, not a few battles had been decided by professional mercenary organizations unbound by nationality or politics, knowing only how to execute contracts with cold precision. The list presented by security advisors included several notorious names. Units that had participated in coups in Africa, escorted oil convoys in the Middle Eastern desert, or rescued hostages in European capitals. After several rounds of secret negotiations, Caracas settled on one name, Black Spear, a medium-sized but extremely battle-hardened mercenary organization made up of former US, UK, and Russian special forces, and even some officers discharged from regular forces. The Venezuelan special envoy flew to a third country sitting in a discreet hotel room to sign the contract. The term was clear: wipe out the covert US, and base at Bermuda, double the reward for a safe withdrawal without a trace. Across the table, Black Spear's representative just smiled, asking no questions about the reason, debating no politics. To them, this was simply a job, and every job had a price. As soon as the contract was signed, Black Spear began its analysis. They did not act hastily like the Venezuelan suicide squad. Instead, they gathered satellite data, studied the seabed terrain simulated approach routes, and looked for blind spots in the U.S. defense system. A tactical operations room was set up in Caracas, where Venezuelan officers played only an observer role, while the entire plan was in the hands of battle-tested mercenaries. The difference was clear right from the preparation phase. While the Venezuelan suicide squad plunged into Bermuda with only hatred, Black Spear approached like a cold surgeon's team. They analyzed the sweep speed of the U.S. sonar, finding the gap between two sweeps to infiltrate. They tested mobile electromagnetic jamming devices, powerful enough to temporarily blind the defense system. And most importantly, they did not aim for a direct confrontation, but only a single, swift, lethal strike. Within the Venezuelan cabinet, many still doubted that hiring mercenaries meant entrusting the nation's fate to foreigners who only cared about money. But after the disastrous failure of the suicide squad, they had no other choice. Beneath the Bermuda waves, the currents roared, as they had for millennia. But this time, the silence was only a cover for an impending underwater storm. No longer were there naive Venezuelan soldiers, but an international mercenary team carrying the most modern skills and weapons. Caracas had bet everything, money, honor, and national security on these strangers. If they succeeded, Venezuela would have its sweetest revenge yet. But if they failed, it would be the final end, not just for an underwater base, but for the country standing on the international stage. Following the devastating failure of the Venezuelan suicide squad, the Caracas government decided to open its coffers, hiring a professional force to continue the mission of vengeance. Massive amounts of money were drawn from a secret oil fund, transferred through multiple financial intermediaries, and finally flowed into the hands of an international mercenary organization. This was a collection of veterans who had fought in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans, bringing with them intense combat experience and the cold-bloodedness of those who lived only for a contract. Upon arriving in Caracas, the mercenary team immediately began analysis. They did not act emotionally, but deployed their work like a military surgery. The operations room was established with huge screens displaying satellite data, seabed maps, and 3D models of the Bermuda area. Everything was processed down to the meter of water. Technology experts reviewed the previous data collected by the Venezuelan Navy. The results showed that the U.S. defense system was designed in 3 layers. The outermost layer was continuous sonar scanning, detecting any object. The middle layer was an electromagnetic net, capable of crippling all electronic devices, and the innermost layer consisted of automated torpedoes and submerged UAVs on standby. This was a fortress under the sea, an almost impenetrable structure. The analysis team worked continuously for days to find a weakness. Finally, they found a loophole in the sonar sweep process. A blind spot existed lasting 14 seconds between 2 transmissions. With precise calculation, it was possible to slip through this gap without detection. However, the margin of error was nearly 0. A single second delay would mean the entire force would be exposed. The next issue was the electromagnetic net. An engineer on the team who had previously served on an electromagnetic weapon project in Europe proposed using a mobile pulse generator. When activated, this device would create a jamming zone, lasting a few minutes, temporarily blinding the electromagnetic net. That brief window was the only opportunity to pass through the second line of defense. For the innermost layer, the only choice was to avoid direct engagement. Automated torpedoes were capable of wiping out an entire fleet, so a firefight would only lead to disaster. The solution proposed was passive stealth, swimming close to the seabed, maintaining absolute silence, using mini submarines covered with sound-reducing material. From there, the entire team could approach the base's resupply gate, the least protected entrance, as it was only used for logistics. The mission objective was not to seize, but to destroy. Structural demolition bombs were chosen as the primary weapon, a compact block of explosives with tremendous penetrating power. Placed at the right spot, it would collapse entire sections of steel and concrete. Just 3 simultaneous detonations at the energy core, the command center, and the arms depot, and the entire base would be submerged by the sheer pressure of the seawater. Throughout the preparation process, the mercenary team maintained a cold demeanor, no oaths of honor, no political slogans. Everything revolved around precision and effectiveness. Every step had a contingency plan, even a plan to sacrifice a small group to save the rest if the worst-case scenario occurred. When the plan was finalized, Caracas could only put its trust in these strangers. The rage following the submarine's disappearance had transformed into enormous financial motivation, enough to purchase an entire hired war machine. The mission was codenamed Bermuda Ghost, and it was expected to change the game. Outside the sky over the Venezuelan capital was bright with lights, but on the other side of the hemisphere beneath the Bermuda waves, a new nightmare was being prepared, cold and precise as a blade held to America's throat. Bermuda night was thick with stillness, the sea surface calm, but underneath was a labyrinth of military technology. The mercenary team was ready. After weeks of preparation, they left a secret port on a disguised cargo ship carrying 2 mini-submarines hidden within steel shipping containers. These were stealth, sonar-resistant vehicles, specially designed to overcome underwater defenses. As the clock struck midnight, the mini-subs left the hold, slowly diving hundreds of meters deep. The Bermuda seawater was murky and highly magnetic, rendering civilian equipment nearly useless. But the mercenary team did not rely on GPS. They used an inertial navigation system combined with a 3D bathymetric map constructed from satellite images and prior measurements. Every groove and fissure on the seabed had been memorized. Approaching the base's outer perimeter was the first challenge. The U.S. sonar system swept continuously like an invisible taut net. After calculating the sweep rhythm, the team determined the 14-second blind spot between 2 transmissions. In that brief moment, the entire team had to sprint through like underwater arrows, their bodies pressed against the seabed, each person slipping into coral crevices to minimize the reflective surface area. A slight deviation would mean instant detection and annihilation. Upon reaching the electromagnetic net, they deployed the mobile EMP device, small metal spheres that emitted a pulse strong enough to temporarily blind the system for a few minutes. A precious opportunity opened up. Without a sound, the team slid through the electromagnetic net, advancing deep into the innermost, most heavily guarded area. Here, massive steel tunnels appeared faintly in the weak light emitted from the base. This was the resupply route, the least guarded entrance, because it only served logistics. The mercenary team moved close to the wall step by step, advancing deep into the fortress's heart. The destruction mission was executed swiftly. Structural demolition bombs were attached at 3 critical points: the energy core, the command center, and the arms depot. This type of bomb was compact, weighing only about 10 kilograms, but with devastating penetrating power. When detonated, it would not create a large explosion on the surface, but strike directly at the concrete and steel structure, causing the entire dome to collapse, allowing seawater to rush in and flood the base. The timer was set for 20 minutes. Then the entire team retreated along the pre-calculated exit route. To blind the surveillance system, they released signal jamming devices, creating sonar ghosts to mislead the U.S. sensors. As the mini-subs left the dangerous area, a faint light flared up beneath the sea from a distance. Then a massive tremor shook the entire body of water. A column of water shot straight up in the middle of Bermuda, dozens of meters high, reflecting the cold moonlight. The entire U.S. underwater base was torn apart, seawater crashing into the steel compartments, sweeping away equipment, weapons, and the lives of the trapped soldiers. In minutes, the structure once considered a technological pride had turned into a deep black void. The mercenary team retreated in silence, vanishing from Bermuda as if they had never been there. Behind them was only absolute destruction. On the surface, the sea returned to its calm appearance. But in the deep, a top-tier U.S. defense secret had just been wiped out. When the first reports of the explosion reached U.S. radar stations, it was already too late. The base was gone, data was unsaved, and soldiers had no time to escape. This was the boldest strike against Washington in decades, and the spark that pushed the regional situation into an uncontrollable storm. The next morning, Bermuda was no longer a tranquil sea. Weather radar stations recorded a column of water shooting up dozens of meters high during the night. The shock data spread throughout the surveillance system. Initial signals reported to the Pentagon indicated an extremely large anomaly, but no one suspected it was the complete collapse of a secret base. When a USP-8 Poseidon anti-submarine warfare squadron was urgently deployed to the area, the sight that greeted the crew was chilling. The sea surface was slick, with enormous oil patches interspersed with metal fragments swirling in the currents. Navy sonar swept down, receiving only an unusually wide, deep hole covered by countless fragmented signals. The underwater base that once existed beneath Bermuda was completely eradicated. Initial reports suggested this could not have been an accident. The level of destruction was calculated with the dome collapsing at 3 key structural points: This meant there was a deliberate human hand placing explosives, not a natural disaster or technical failure. The only question remaining was, who did it? In the Pentagon, the atmosphere was thick with fury. Billions of US dollars poured into the facility. Decades of new weapon research along with the sacrifice of hundreds of soldiers all vanished in less than half an hour. But even heavier was the strategic stain. For the first time, a US base was completely destroyed by an unseen enemy. This was not just a military failure, but a direct blow to global prestige. Intelligence agencies immediately compiled data. The unusual financial transaction chain of Venezuela stood out first. Over the past month, billions of US dollars were withdrawn from the oil fund transferred through intermediaries in Africa and Eastern Europe. This information coincided with fragmented reports about the appearance of an international mercenary group in Caracas. The puzzle pieces fit together to paint a clear picture. Venezuela had hired someone to destroy the Bermuda base. Washington's response was immediate. The White House declared the highest security alert status across the entire Caribbean KJB region. The Treasury Department issued a new sanctions package, freezing all Venezuelan assets in the international system, cutting off all remaining transaction channels. Partner banks were forced to cease cooperation, pushing Caracas virtually to the sidelines of the global financial system. Economic sanctions, however, were just the beginning. The U.S. quickly deployed its military might. A carrier strike group left Norfolk Knoff and headed straight for the Caribbean Sea. In the Florida Sky B, 52 seconds were put on standby, performing simulated strategic bombing flights. Bases in Puerto Rico and Guantanamo had troop reinforcements, all raising their alert levels to the maximum. International media exploded. Satellite images of the U.S. aircraft carrier parting the waves toward Venezuela spread rapidly. Western television channels called it the Bermuda Fury, while South American media described the situation as an approaching steel storm. Analysis pieces revisited historical precedents, comparing it to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when two superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear war. Caracas chose silence, neither announcing nor claiming responsibility nor denying it. But behind the scenes, officials viewed this as a historic victory. For the first time, a South American nation could strike directly at the world's #1 superpower. That brief sense of pride was enough to soothe the pain of losing the submarine Simón Bolívar and the prior failure of the Suicide Squad. The silence could not hide a truth. The spiral of conflict had been activated. Washington considered this an act of war. And once the U.S. military machine started moving, it would not stop until it crushed the challenger. The Caribbean Sea was no longer a tropical tourist area, but a huge powder keg awaiting a spark to ignite. When the final report from Bermuda was confirmed, Washington had no choice but to transition to a full-scale reaction. The attack on the underwater base cost the U.S. billions of dollars in investment and dozens of military lives, but it was also an open challenge to global credibility. A superpower could not allow this stain to remain without an appropriate answer. Within 24 hours, a series of urgent orders were issued. The aircraft carrier fleet left Norfolk, accompanied by dozens of F-35 fighter jets and an anti-submarine helicopter squadron heading straight for the Caribbean. Virginia-class nuclear submarines were simultaneously deployed quietly, moving beneath the ocean to control the entire sea area. In the sky, B-52 seconds took off from Barksdale Bale Air Force Base, performing show-of-force flights with simulated strategic attack paths. What shocked the world even more was Washington's deployment of strategic nuclear forces. Commercial satellite images captured a convoy carrying ballistic missiles, leaving storage and heading towards the Air Force Base in Florida. Although there was no official declaration, the message being sent was clear: the U.S. was ready to raise the level of deterrence to the highest threshold. This was not just retaliation against Venezuela, but a warning to any adversary who dared to attack U.S. facilities. At the same time, bases in Puerto Rico, Guantanamo, and Panama all increased their troop levels. Defense radars were placed on 24/7 readiness. Marines were deployed along coastal routes, while the U.S. Navy established a blockade around the Caribbean. All vessels entering and exiting the area were subjected to strict inspection, creating the atmosphere of an actual war zone. On the diplomatic front, the White House launched an aggressive media campaign. U.S. officials declared that an act of state terrorism had occurred, implicitly accusing Venezuela of being behind the destruction of the Bermuda base. NATO allies quickly voiced support, promising to share intelligence and technical assistance. Western media constantly broadcast footage of the U.S. aircraft carrier parting the waves, accompanied by commentary Washington was preparing for a 21st century Cuban-style crisis. Caracas conversely sank into silence. No statements, no rebuttals, no evidence of denial. But that silence only convinced Washington that Venezuela was the culprit. In the eyes of international public opinion, the silence was interpreted as a tacit admission. U.S. intelligence also provided further evidence: unusual flights from Caracas to an Eastern European country just before the explosion, along with the massive amount of money withdrawn from the Venezuelan banking system. Although not enough for a public case at the UN, this data reinforced Washington's resolve to act with immediate deterrence. Analysts warned that the U.S. deploying nuclear weapons near the front line was not just to intimidate Venezuela, it was also a message to Russia and China, two nations that maintained close relations with Caracas. In Washington's view, the attack on the Bermuda base could be a test orchestrated by major rivals. Therefore, the U.S. chose to display maximum power to extinguish any budding ideas. The Caribbean Sea thus became a giant stage for military power. Aircraft carriers, submarines, strategic bombers, and even nuclear missiles converged on an area previously only known for tropical tourism. Tensions reached a peak. Neighboring countries, like Colombia, Brazil, and Cuba, had to put their armies on high alert, fearing the flames of war could spread to their territories at any time. In the eyes of the Venezuelan people, a grim prospect was emerging. The successful revenge had bought them enormous fury. They knew that with a single order from Washington, the entire country could turn into a battleground. And with the U.S. placing nuclear weapons near the border, the Caribbean had officially become the world's largest powder keg. Caracas's initial silence soon became a burden as global media was flooded with images of the U.S. fleet advancing on the Caribbean and B-52 seconds flying over Florida. Pressure within Venezuela's leadership surged. Generals held continuous high-tension meetings. The strike on Bermuda brought a temporary feeling of satisfaction. But now, the shadow of vengeance was covering the entire nation. The Venezuelan government officially put its military on the highest state of readiness. Aging S-300S-3 Chum air defense systems bought from Russia were activated. Short-range missiles were deployed around Caracas and along the coast. The small navy had patrol ships hugging the sea area. But everyone understood that against a U.S. force equipped with aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and B-52 seconds, these measures were largely symbolic. Caracas also intensified reliance on international relations with communication channels, with Moscow, Moscova, and Beijing running non-stop. Russia promised to share intelligence and provide advisory experts. China, though, cautious, left open the possibility of financial support and some dual-use technology equipment. However, both powers stopped at discreet support, avoiding direct confrontation with the U.S. This made Venezuela feel even more isolated in the eye of the storm. Domestically, the atmosphere was tense. People rushed to stock up on essentials, fuel, and medicine. Major cities were rife with rumors of a potential U.S. preemptive strike. Satellite images of U.S. bases in Puerto Rico and Guantanamo circulating on social media were likened to a raised arm just waiting to strike down. Venezuelan leaders tried to maintain an outward calm. National television broadcast messages asserting the country's readiness to defend its sovereignty while calling for national unity. But behind the scenes, anxiety was visible in every eye. Caracas knew very well that once the U.S. considered this an act of war, they would not stop at threats. Military advisors analyzed several scenarios. The most likely was that the U.S. would employ a comprehensive suppression strategy, maritime blockade, tactical bombing of military bases and oil infrastructure, the lifeline of the Venezuelan economy. Another more dangerous scenario was the U.S. choosing maximum deterrence, putting nuclear missiles on alert, and signaling that any move from Caracas could lead to destruction. Given the situation, Venezuela was forced to recalculate. On one hand, they wanted to preserve the pride after successfully retaliating. On the other hand, they understood that direct confrontation with the U.S. meant suicide. The government began to play a two-sided game, publicly calling for dialogue and peace, but secretly arming paramilitary groups in the mountains, preparing for guerrilla warfare if conflict erupted. The mercenary team, the ones who planted the bombs to destroy the Bermuda base, also vanished from Caracas. They received a massive payment and were secretly escorted out of the territory. But the trace they left became a thorn. U.S. intelligence would surely follow it, and that could leave Venezuela exposed. Caracas seemed to stand at a crossroads, either continue the silence and endure the immense pressure from the US, or openly challenge and accept the scenario of total war. Whichever choice was made, the result was a cloudy future. In internal analyses, one phrase was repeated: the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is replaying. But this time, the focus was not Havana, but Caracas. And what was more dangerous was that this crisis had no clear path back because both sides had gone too far. The Caribbean Sea had never been so densely packed with military hardware. The US aircraft carrier fleet cut through the waves like a mobile steel city surrounded by Aegis destroyers, nuclear submarines, and continuous takeoff, divided by landing operations by F-35 squadrons. In the sky, giant B-52 seconds flew show-of-force flights along the edge of Venezuelan airspace. The entire region was turned into a stage for deterrence where all international eyes were focused. Opposite Venezuela struggled to deploy what it had. S-300 air defense systems purchased from Russia were activated, deployed around the capital Caracas and strategic oil fields. Short-range Scud missile launchers were moved to the battle positions. Although everyone knew they would hardly penetrate the US defense net, the small Venezuelan Navy lined the coast with old ships, small compared to US destroyers. But carrying the message this nation would not easily yield. The tension was like a stretched string. A single slight touch could shatter everything. Small skirmishes had begun to appear. A US reconnaissance aircraft was locked onto by the Venezuelan radar system for a few seconds, forcing it to change course. A Venezuelan patrol boat approached the carrier strike group, too closely, immediately warned by flare signals. Every situation carried the risk of turning into a real conflict. Washington increased pressure by deliberately leaking images of nuclear missiles moving to the Florida base. No official statement was needed. Just the leaked satellite images were enough to send the message the US was ready to escalate the crisis to the highest level. Analysts called this the strategy of nuclear ghost deterrence, pressuring Venezuela to back down. Meanwhile, Caracas chose to create a prolonged standoff. Instead of direct confrontation, they secretly equipped paramilitary groups in the jungles and mountains, preparing for guerrilla warfare if the US attacked. Strategic oil fields were set with time-delayed mines, ready to be turned into an economic weapon if the situation spiraled out of control. The entire nation was mobilized for full defense. Despite limited resources, the international community faced a chaotic scene. The UN organized an emergency session calling for restraint from both sides, but was largely powerless. Russia and China criticized the US for aggression, but avoided making public commitments, fearing direct confrontation. South American nations were extremely anxious, fearing the flames of war would spread to their territories. The entire region became the highest-risk area on the planet. On the media front, both sides intensified psychological warfare. Washington constantly released images of its military might to sow a sense of invincibility. Caracas capitalized on the David versus Goliath narrative, emphasizing this was a fight to protect the sovereignty of a small nation against a superpower. The two opposing narratives pushed the populace into a state of extreme tension. Amidst the rapid developments, one question haunted everyone. Where is the ignition point? A radar glitch, an unintentional collision, or a rash decision by leaders on either side? Any situation could turn the Caribbean into a battlefield. And with the US deploying nuclear weapons to the front line, the line between conventional war and global catastrophe became thinner than ever. The Caribbean was no longer a sun-drenched tourist area, but had become the world's largest powder keg. Every day that passed without gunfire was a fragile stroke of luck. But everyone understood that luck could not last forever. As the Caribbean turned into a powder keg, shockwaves spread across the globe. No one could stand on the sidelines anymore. The US-Venezuela standoff had moved beyond the regional scope, becoming an international crisis with complex calculations by global powers. Russia was the first to react. Moscow spoke out criticizing Washington for using the nuclear stick to threaten a small nation. Pro-Kremlin television channels continuously aired analyses. Russian military advisors secretly arrived in Caracas, helping upgrade air defense systems and reinforce the command network. While there was no commitment to direct intervention, Russia's presence immediately caused discomfort in Washington. This was clearly no longer just a matter between the US and Venezuela. China chose an indirect but no less sharp approach. Beijing avoided overly harsh public statements, but covertly expanded economic cooperation with Caracas. Urgent loans, new oil contracts, and some dual-use technology shipments were sent to South America. This not only gave Venezuela more resources to hold out, but also showed China's desire to turn the crisis into an opportunity to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere, long considered the US backyard. In Europe, NATO was in an awkward position. On one hand, allies publicly supported Washington, emphasizing that US security was also the alliance's security. But on the other hand, many European nations feared escalating nuclear tensions would destabilize the globe. Behind the scenes, secret diplomatic channels were activated to persuade the US to restrain itself, avoiding the escalation into full-scale war. The UN convened an emergency session, but resolutions calling for restraint quickly reached a deadlock. The US adamantly blamed Venezuela, while Russia and China vetoed all attempts at international sanctions. The Security Council was deeply divided, clearly exposing the opposition between power blocs. Neighboring South American countries were in extreme panic. Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina all increased troop levels at their borders, fearing a wave of refugees and the risk of the conflict spilling into their territories. Cuba announced its support for Venezuela, also calling on the US to immediately cease its hegemonic policies. But realistically, no nation in the region was strong enough to change the situation. In the international academic community, analyses emerged rapidly. Some argued that the US could not allow Venezuela to escape blame, as that would set a precedent for other small nations to dare to challenge. Conversely, many experts warned that Washington had gone too far by deploying nuclear weapons to the front line, inadvertently increasing the risk of an uncontrollable confrontation. All agreed on one point: the Caribbean was rapidly approaching a global crisis. Global financial markets also experienced severe volatility. Oil prices soared on fears of supply disruption from Venezuela. International shipping companies avoided the Caribbean maritime routes. Even many insurance companies refused to underwrite contracts for ships passing through the area. The geopolitical crisis immediately transformed into an economic crisis, affecting every nation and business. In this context, a cold truth became evident. The US and Venezuela were no longer merely two rivals. This was a game involving multiple powers. Each side had its own calculations, and the more hands involved, the higher the risk of chaos. The world held its breath, knowing that any shot fired could trigger a chain reaction, pulling both Russia and China into the spiral. A new kind of nuclear crisis was no longer a distant hypothesis, but was right before their eyes. The Caribbean now was not only the battlefield of the US and Venezuela, it had become the epicenter of global geopolitics, where the future of the world order was being tested daily. After weeks of standoff, the Caribbean remained taut as a drum. The US fleet held its position off the coast of Venezuela. Meanwhile, Caracas's air defense and short-range missile sites maintained the highest combat readiness. B-52 and F-35 flights continued to cross the region's skies, a daily reminder that war could erupt at any moment. But neither side dared to cross the first red line. Washington understood that a direct invasion would mire the US in a swamp-damage international credibility and risk triggering a response from Russia and China. Caracas also understood that a single US preemptive strike would crush their entire economic and military infrastructure within days. The mutual deterrence created a state of limbo. Peace was absent, but war had not yet begun. Meanwhile, global media continued to churn. Every satellite image of military hardware movement, every rumor about nuclear weapons stationed in Florida or US. Submarines approaching the Venezuelan coast became a sensational headline. People everywhere followed it like a grand play. But for those involved, it was a game of life and death. In Caracas, the leadership was divided. One faction wanted to maintain silence, prolonging the crisis to bargain with the US and leverage covert support from allies. The other faction feared that silence would only back Venezuela into a corner, gradually losing international support. But despite the fierce debate, no one could find a way out. The nation was now like a small boat in a storm, only able to toss and turn with every big wave from Washington. In Washington, the situation was no simpler. A segment of politicians pushed for aggressive action to restore prestige after the Bermuda shock. But military circles understood that any hasty action risked turning the Caribbean into a nuclear battleground. Secret reports constantly emphasized that the risk of uncontrollable escalation was higher than ever. Yet in the atmosphere of political pressure, these warnings might not be listened to for long. International markets continued to reel. Oil prices remained high. Maritime traffic in the Caribbean was paralyzed, further stressing economies dependent on trade. South American countries already fragile politically and economically were caught in the spiral of instability. The risk of spillover extended beyond the two nations, turning the entire continent into a crisis zone. In the international analytical community, more voices argued that this was indeed the Cuban Missile Crisis 21st Century edition. But more dangerously, this time there were no clear direct dialogue channels, nor a safe path back. Instead, there were layers of overlapping calculations where every move could trigger a chain reaction. The Caribbean, once a sun-drenched tourist area, had become the focal point of global anxiety. People lived in fear, while governments calculated every step to avoid a catastrophic scenario. The world understood that one small mistake, a torpedo misfired, a radar lock held too long, could make everything explode. And precisely in this fragile state, the crisis dragged on day after day like a wound that wouldn't heal. No one knew if it would conclude with a secret agreement or explode into total war. The only certainty was that since the Bermuda incident, the world order had changed. The US was no longer invulnerable. Venezuela, though small, had proven that a nation daring to challenge could create global repercussions. And all of humanity had to live with a chilling truth. The Caribbean had become the century's ticking time bomb.